Today in the EU, from Ukraine to Gaza, EU foreign ministers face tough discussions. EU foreign affairs ministers are meeting in Brussels today to discuss about a number of pressing issues at the very borders of the European Union. But what can we expect from this meeting? Hello and welcome. I am Evi Chiori and this is Euractiv's Today in the EU. To look into the intricacies of the Foreign Affairs Summit, we invited in our studio Alexandra Brzozowski, Euractiv's Global Europe editor. Alex, what are the topics EU foreign ministers will be discussing at this meeting?
So we're really looking towards a very heavy agenda Foreign Affairs Week, actually this week, with ministers meeting today, but also the EU-Ukraine Association Council tomorrow that will discuss the accession process, and then the March EU Summit later this week, which will be one of the key meetings for this spring. Two major topics are on the agenda, like in the past few months. So we have Russia's war in Ukraine and the situation in the Middle East, where foreign ministers have to prepare essentially the run-up to the summit later this week. So they will also meet with US Secretary of State Blinken via VTC as special guest, and the regular video call with Ukraine's Foreign Minister Kuleba is also on the agenda.
Let's dissect this a little bit. What can we expect on Ukraine, especially after the past week's significant efforts to step up the military support?
On Ukraine, indeed, we expect that foreign ministers will kick off the discussions on further and more sustainable military aid. So there is a sense that the red thread throughout this week will be exactly that. It has become a bit of a race against time to deliver essential aid to Ukraine, especially with the anticipated Russian offensive this spring or certainly before summer. So we understand that discussions will mostly evolve around the ammunition effort and also the Czech-led initiative that has already sourced 800,000 rounds outside the bloc and is currently also looking for further pledges by EU member states.
And what are the expectations on this?
They are expected to officially adopt a deal which EU ambassadors gave their green light to last week. Last Wednesday, they agreed to the creation of the Ukraine Assistance Fund, which boosts the bloc's off-budget European Peace Facility with an extra 5 billion.
That sounds very important.
It's been seen really as a big win for Kiev, especially after months of uncertainty and haggling over French and German demands on this issue.
Will ministers sign it off? Not everyone is happy with it, so what's the urgency?
It's true that there has been a lot of criticism that the now agreed modalities for the fund are more of an accounting procedure than actually fresh cash.
Okay, so how does this work?
So the EPF is used to normally partially reimburse member states for weapons they provide to Ukraine. Under the current rules, member states delivered equipment to Ukraine, handed in the receipt, and then they were reimbursed a specific distribution key. But now, despite its name, the Ukraine Assistance Fund won't actually see a 5 billion infusion of cash, as bilateral weapons shipments can be counted somehow as in-kind contributions.
And what does it mean?
So this will mean that billions of euros worth of weapons are still sent to Ukraine, but the bilateral arms shipments to Ukraine will be discounted from cash contributions to the fund at a level of roughly 43%. But that also means that for every 2.3 euros roughly in weapons that a country gives to Ukraine, it can deduct 1 euro from what it owes to the fund. This means still that as long as member states give enough bilateral aid, they won't have to give any money to the fund, which was a key demand by Germany. But some countries, and although they agreed to the deal in the end, they would have preferred to send money to the fund rather than give weapons directly to the Ukraine themselves. Especially that was true for smaller countries that might not have enough to give from stocks or a strong industry to tap into. So that's still a question that might come up during the discussions today. But EU diplomats we talked to in the run-up to the meeting primarily wanted to emphasize that the optic signal this deal has sent, especially in light of missing US support, was the bigger significant issue to do it right before the summit.
We know that one country in particular, yes, we mean Hungary, has expressed reservations about supporting Ukraine through the European Peace Facility and now the new fund as well. And Alex, the problem seems to not be solved.
No, the problem is not solved actually. And yes, indeed, amid our euphoria about the deal, we somehow forgot that Hungary still keeps blocking the eighth tranche of reimbursements under the original EPF. And there's also not really an indication that Budapest would lift its veto anytime soon. So it's also likely to do the same thing with the next tranches in the future. So the question how to address this will be also one of the issues that will need to be discussed after the deal is approved.
Finalized.
But and it seems like there's not really an answer to how to make or what to offer Budapest to remove its veto.
And what precedent does this create?
What this, however, creates is also a backlog in reimbursements. So this might come back to bite the EU in the long term because the next tranches theoretically already would have to be paid out. And that kind of prevents moving on.
In relation to the Ukraine discussion, do you see the results of Sunday's presidential elections in Russia influencing the discussion? Will this be one of the topics on the table, or?
The meeting today happens the day after the Russian election, which we all think, I think we knew the outcome already before.
Not much change there.
Not much changed, but what this adds to is the fact that, it cements the issue that we will have Putin until 2030. And I think that's also something that, in the run-up to the summit, EU leaders will have to keep in mind when they will discuss about the war and the long-term perspective of the war later this week.
And looking at today, do you think countries will react in some way?
For today, Germany, Lithuania and Sweden were among some of the countries that were calling for a more specific new sanctions regime against Russia, also especially after the death of Alexei Navalny recently.
Und im Lichte dieses Sanktionssystem wird auch der Tod von Alexei Navalny.
Indeed, the German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock called for more European Union sanctions against Russia already at the Foreign Ministers' Council in February.
This is not yet really set in stone, but the common understanding, as we understand it, is that there's the desire to move towards a more specific sanctions regime over that issue. So that's certainly part of the discussions.
Now, the worsening situation in Gaza will be the other hot topic on the agenda. EU's chief diplomat Josep Borrell has been very outspoken about this.
Humanitarian assistance needs to get into the Gaza, and the European Union is working as much as we can in order to make it possible. But this is a humanitarian crisis which is not a natural disaster. It's not a flood. It's not a earthquake. It's a man-made. And when we look for alternative ways of providing support by sea or by air, we have to remind that we have to do it because the natural way of providing support through roads is being closed, artificially closed. And starvation is being used as a war arm. And when we condemn this happening in Ukraine, we have to use the same words for what's happening in Gaza.
Mentioned Josep Borrell at the UN Security Council on March 12th. The maritime aid corridor from Cyprus to Gaza was put in motion this week. How are these efforts going?
As we understand, the focus of foreign ministers will be heavily actually on the humanitarian situation and not really, there are no decisions foreseen to be taken on Monday at least. So the United Nations estimates that more than 500,000 of Gaza's 2.3 million people are on the brink of starvation. There are also expectations that they will somehow update their assessment of the situation probably earlier this week. So we will see where they will be moving towards. But again, the expectation is that they will actually declare it a famine.
Maybe it's worth explaining a little bit more. How did we get to this point?
So it took really about 4 months of diplomatic negotiations involving the EU, US, UK and other countries to convince Israel to agree to a maritime corridor. And last week, we also saw the first ship of aid arriving over the sea route. However, we also spoke to the EU's humanitarian aid chief last week, and he warned in the interview with us and some other media that the maritime aid is not enough, by far not enough, and the most effective way would be actually to go over the land route and use the border crossings between Israel and Gaza or Egypt. So far, those land border crossings have been very restricted. So only very, very few aid shipments and trucks have been coming through, especially because that's something that Israel has been monitoring also very closely. And since they insist on checking the aid before it goes through to Gaza, that has slowed down procedures as well significantly. All of that is kind of also fed with the worry that a potential Israeli intervention in Rafah could even worsen the situation. So that's why the humanitarian aspects will be also more in the forefront. Mm-hmm. And also, at the same time as foreign ministers meet today, there's a big humanitarian forum in Brussels where many of them will actually participate. A lot of NGOs are present. Mm-hmm. And one of the main issues, obviously not the main issue it has become, will be also how to ease the situation in Gaza.
Are we anywhere closer to a stop to the fighting?
Not really, Effie. So ministers will discuss the regional dimension of the conflict, plus how to prepare for a process towards a two-state solution in the future. But for many EU diplomats, it's actually hard to see how to discuss any of such peace proposals in earnest, be it the EU, US, or Arab state proposals, under the current circumstances, and especially as it is really unclear how long the current situation will go on. What will be definitely interesting to watch today is what comes out of the talks with Blinken. Mm-hmm. He was supposed to join one of the earlier foreign ministers' meetings and discuss at length the Middle East and how potential regional escalation could be prevented. But that has never really fit into the agenda as we understand. And, at least it's a VTC. Mm-hmm. So there will be probably enough room to compare notes.
And what else should we keep an eye on?
Beyond the two major topics, I think one more thing that really will be an interesting discussion could be Belarus, especially how to encourage democratic forces in the country, and essentially also with the thought, and I think that's something that, especially with the enlargement process and the increased attention to EU accession talks. I mean, we saw Armenia, for example, recently saying that they could imagine applying for EU membership.
Maybe this is stimulating Belarus as well.
So there is a bit of a thought of the day after in Belarus as well. And in that sense, focusing on how to support the opposition, but also how to prevent the human rights situation will be on the agenda. There is a sense that some member states would welcome more sanctions on Belarus as well, also in relation to its support of Russia's war in Ukraine. But so far, no decision is expected. But in general, I think next sanction packages could see more measures implemented against Belarus.
Thank you, Alex, for the very important insights. I am Evi Chiori, and this was Today in the EU. Visit Euractiv to stay on top of the latest news. Sign up for our podcast newsletter. If you haven't subscribed yet, you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever it is that you get your podcasts. This episode was produced by myself, Miriam Saenz de Tejada, and Nicoleta Yonta. Thank you for tuning in. We will be back tomorrow. As part of our commitment to accuracy, inclusion, and transparency, Euractiv is part of the Trust Project.